to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today I'll be speaking with Shawn Wierzbowski about best practices in recruitment and retention of laboratory technicians. Now, as the founder and lead recruiter for Intro, Shawn helps place laboratory technicians throughout the country, and I think his aim is for the world as well. This experience has given him unique insights into what it takes to attract and keep top talent, which he'll be sharing with us today. So, Shawn, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. So, if there's one challenge that it isn't an easy fix, I think it's recruitment and retention. And we've talked about this in a couple different venues, and I've spoke with others about this, so I don't think it's a big surprise. And I know that's one of the areas that you, Shawn, and other laboratory recruiters put your finger on as a big culprit of is the lack of training programs. Now, and you've talked about that recently at the recent COLA conference. We spoke about that, and Andy and I spoke about that in a previous podcast. And I just want to know, is that really the core problem we're facing? And if so, why aren't we fixing it?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris, and thanks for having me. I think that really what I noticed when I started, right when COVID started, was that, there was a shortage, but with all these new labs opening up and hiring medical technologists, it just really, really extended the crisis even more.
Right.
And I do think training programs are part of it because, when I was in high school, even college, I never even heard of medical technology programs. My three sisters are nurses, and not once did a medical technology program even come across their radar. So I think that's a big problem. I know in my home state of Maryland, there's only about 4 different programs that do this with about average classes. So that's definitely part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay. And why aren't we fixing this then? If this is the problem, if you're not the only person who's speaking about that at the COLA conference, and it's come up in other studies, etc. Why aren't we fixing this? Why aren't we, if there's a need in the market, we live in that kind of world. Why aren't we fixing it? I mean, do you see are there some practical issues? Is it political? What's going on? Is there no will? What's going on here?
That's a good question. So from the education perspective, I am not too sure. I don't know what goes into actually creating a new program if they're trying to make money off of it. But one thing I have seen is labs kind of take this into their own hands and have their own training programs where they train bio grads and chemistry grads. And it's certainly not hey, we're going to throw them into the fire and treat them the same as lab technologists. They actually have like year 1, this is what you're doing. Year 2, this is what you're doing. And come year 3, you're actually a lab technologist. And these labs have seen success with this. The biggest thing, though, is if you lose someone after 2 years, all that training was for nothing. And so that's one of the flaws in that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of recruitment. I know that's kind of your that's your bread and butter. We've talked again. You and I have talked a little bit about this. I've talked to other people about this. I've written about this in CLP. What are some of the best practices that you use? And I know one thing you do, and I think this is a big trend, not only for what you're doing, but across the board, is you list the salary range in the advertisement or the posting. So what are some of the other best practices beyond just listing, the salary?
Yeah, I mean, salary it saves a lot of time, right? I just had a client who lost someone not through me, but an internal candidate, lost them at the end of the interview process because salary expectations didn't line up. So you got to be transparent about that on the front end. One thing that for me is, when I got into recruiting, it was, hey, make 50 phone calls a day to people, and 10 of them will pick up, and maybe one person will actually be looking for a role. I think that that doesn't work as well in the lab field. I think it's really important to have a digital presence because they're constantly getting recruited that way. Mm-hmm. So for me, about 90% of my placements come from LinkedIn and the content I put out. And I've seen some laboratory managers and
Oh, wow.
directors actually start posting about their own lab on LinkedIn and why they like it, just little videos. And oh my gosh, it's made such a difference with inbound candidates.
Right, right. So, are there any other best practices in terms of? I know. I think you or someone else at the COLA conference spoke about this. I've read about this in other contexts where you have these processes, and I know you have a fairly fast. The way your system works, or the way you work with labs, it's pretty quick. I mean, you're not doing a 4 month. Let's spend 4 months interviewing this candidate 8 times. You're doing it relatively, if I recall, you do it relatively quickly. And what kind of advantages do you have
Yeah.
there?
So, I mean, I can't tell you how many people that have accepted roles who just said, hey, this was actually, you guys were the quickest and you gave me what I wanted, and they
Yeah,
move forward with it. So, I mean, our interview process here
yeah,
is typically one Zoom kind of phone call just to screen for skills, and then within 48 hours, getting them in person, followed by an offer same day. Um, is that always going to work? No, but I'd rather have an offer out there with a 5 day deadline than put the pressure on everyone else.
yeah, yeah. Well, and the other thing too, and I've known people who have hired people over the years, and particularly say on the government side, and it can take 6 months. And they finally at 6 months they say, okay, I'm going to hire you, and that person goes back. Well, that's great. I've been working at this other job for 3 months. So I mean, not that doesn't necessarily happen, say in a more of a private lab situation, but particularly these days, you know, when a lot the lab technicians are diamonds. You're not they're not just out there. You're having to search for them, particularly good ones. I mean, so that's the other thing. I mean, it's a question of you can find somebody, but you need to find somebody good to fill that role for sure. So, um, one thing you touched on, which I think is really interesting, is and you you've talked a lot about this a few times that we've spoken, that this idea that really how the lab is presenting itself, and you just mentioned on LinkedIn the lab uh, manager uh, sending, putting stuff on LinkedIn, we're a great place to work, etc. So certainly you can have that perception. So certainly you want to have a perception that you're good, but also how do you develop a good work environment that's reality, that you're going to retain someone, because it's one thing to get somebody in the door, it's another thing to keep them. And that is, if there's a big cost center for labs or any employer, it's turnover. You have to spend a lot of time recruiting, hiring someone like you, etc. So what are some of the let's talk about maybe some retention strategies as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and so big thing with retention, Chris. I know we talked about this, but we ran a study. We got 365 people to respond. What lab technologist was, hey, what was your biggest motivation for leaving your last role? All right, and so
Right.
65% said pay, 15% said advancement, and 20% said understaffing. And
Wow.
I think you talked about being perceived as a good place to work and actually being a good place to work. I think if you're one way to see if you're actually a good place to work is look at your retention, and specifically why are people leaving. You certainly,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen in my markets that you don't have to pay the highest. You don't have to be 20% higher than everyone else. You just have to be in the top percentile, right? And so if you can stop
Right.
losing people over pay, then that's going to make a big difference.
Right. Right. And also, one of the things certainly with COVID, and now we have a few other, seems like we have another possibly emerging pandemic, and certainly a lot of labs were really slammed. They were understaffed. They were slammed, etc. With workloads. So pay and workloads. So I won't go the whole story, but you and I talked about a story I heard about someone who worked extra hours over a whole summer, and at the end of it netted out like $300. When they were working like almost double shift, and certainly the first thing she told everyone, because the person I heard it from did not do this, but when she told her about it, certainly that was the first thing she told everyone when she got the check was, I didn't get paid. I worked all these extra hours, basically missed out on any sort of relaxation in the summer, thinking that I was going to have this big bonus wad of cash at the end, and now I don't have anything. So there's that, but there's also the whole workload sort of thing to recognize. I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of workload, work-life balance, that we talked a lot about these days, and in terms of just having a place that it doesn't feel like you're on either on a treadmill or you're walking into a prison, or I don't know, you're chained to their bench, whatever, however you want to put it. That you want to have a workplace that I have to work hard, but I'm getting compensated properly, and it's not destroying my soul. I mean, is it and how do you? Again, you can put all sorts of pictures up on the Donut Friday or something on LinkedIn, but how do you turn that perception into reality? I mean, what are some of are there some things that you've worked with? Certainly you're working with, it sounds like one of the big things you have to work with is with pay. I mean, with compensation with your clients. But is there other areas that it's based on this survey that you work with your clients a little bit and say, hey, this is what we got in the survey. It's 300 some odd laboratory technicians got back to us. That's kind of a lot. And they're all saying the same thing. So what would you tell a lab if I was a lab manager and came to you and say, okay, what do I do then? Okay, I can offer more money, but what else do I need to do to increase and help retention in that regard, and based on those responses?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think one trend that I'm starting to see a little bit is, like you talked about, people wanting to be compensated for the extra work they're doing. And one way to do that was to be a travel tech, right? And I think traveling as a medical technologist is awesome. It helps labs that really need help. And they make a lot of money, but they deserve it because they're typically working in the busiest parts of the lab. But I think we're starting to transition to this kind of work-life balance part of a lot of these people's careers. And one thing I'll tell the managers, if we're having trouble filling a role, is, hey, you got this role, it's Monday through Friday. What if we did 410s, right? Because I've had people take the same pay or even a little less, right, to work 410s. And, I think that is definitely something labs need to be looking at is, hey, where can we kind of consolidate the schedules? Because that'll help with attraction a lot. And I think a lot of these travelers, talking to them, they're definitely burned out. They're making good money, right? But they're at the point where, hey, I can't do this forever. I'm starting to get a family, or I want to settle down. And I think work-life balance is going to be more important for them.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that, recruiting is important, retention's important. Getting, we talked a little bit at the front end of our this podcast a little bit about programs, but one thing is how do we get young people interested in this? I mean, I know, and lab technicians are not the only people. We've heard it. Trucking industry, nurses, nursing. There's certain types of doctors who aren't available. There aren't enough of. There's all sorts of problems filling certain types of jobs. So how do we? And you mentioned you never heard about this. You have 3 sisters who are all nurses, and I come from a medical family. My mom was a nurse, and so I know about nursing. I didn't really know about laboratory technicians per se up until I became a medical journalist years ago. But how do we get young people in high school? And does it start in high school, or does it start earlier to get kids interested in scientific careers? And how do we do it? When do we start, and how do we do it?
I wish I knew those answers. It's, in the recruiting world, it's hard to be focused on, how. I'll give you an example, right? So for me, we've had a lot of trouble filling roles, and so we've actually resorted to international recruitment from the Philippines. And some texts kind of give us they're like, "Hey, why are you doing that? It's discouraging people getting into the field." But it's so hard from the recruiting part because our job is to fill roles. Our job is not so much to, how do we get people set up to go into this in 3 years? And I've talked to some programs, like medical technology programs, and they seem to have full enrollment. The problem is just that there's not enough programs. But I have to imagine it starts in high school.
Right.
What do you think?
I think high school. I mean, giving that as an option for sure. But I also think maybe at the even younger. There was there's a lab test lab company or medical testing company that worked with Legos and put together this really fun sort of thing for kids, and I think it was terrific. I mean, we're not going to have, you know, I don't think we're going to have a plethora of kids necessarily wanting to become lab technicians, but I think that maybe it'll steer more kids to that, or at least thinking about it, and maybe that'll open it up. I also like your, kind of your. I think there's a lot of young people who go into, the life sciences, biology, chemistry, etc. And then what do they do? Do they become pharmaceutical reps, or do they, I don't know, get into something else that's related? What you were talking about earlier, having the labs kind of step in and training people, and maybe having contracts. We train you for a year. You have to sign a contract for 5 years or something, or we'll send you to school or something. I don't know. I think there are a lot of different ways to do. To recruit and that would be another recruitment option. If I was getting out of college and I really didn't know what to do, and someone approached me and said, hey, we're this laboratory thing, about biology and chemistry, we'll pay to train, and all you have to do is give us 5 years. That might be particularly if it's in a nice part of the world like where you live in Maryland, that might not be a bad option for them. So I think sooner rather than later. I think what's so interesting is that we really have gotten away from I know when my parents were growing up, science, it was science, 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 and we've gotten away from that. So maybe we just need to, as a culture, we maybe need to get back to it, particularly in light of the pandemic. So.
Yeah,
I hope so. I mean, maybe the silver lining, and I hate to even say this, but maybe a silver lining with the pandemic that'll help you as well is that more young people will be interested in getting into the field and seeing this as an option. And I think that's the thing. I think a lot of times, sometimes, no, not to disparage anyone who has a loved one who's a high school guidance counselor, but sometimes they don't give you all the options that you can follow. So I think that's some of it. And you talked a little bit about international recruiting. I think that's a new an area for you. We talked a little bit about that. I think another thing is also how these professions are perceived as well. I mean, it's on the flip side.
Migrant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you said, like in the Philippines, the country where you've been doing a lot of work, recruiting, it's seen as a good job, a good way to make a living, and a real step up to really help your family and build wealth and that sort of thing as well, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think one thing too, like I was a biology major in college, and a lot of people, including me, I got into bio just because you like science. You don't really know what you're going to do with it. And I think if people, people can see the money in the lab field, right? I know coming out of college in bio, I was hoping to make 30, 40 grand a year, right? But the fact is that, I know it's different in every area, but it kind of around me, bio med tech grads can come out making 60, 70, 75,000 a year. And I think if you start to show people that, it's like, wow, this is actually a really good career. And just because you start in the lab doesn't mean you don't have to stay in the lab forever. I mean, there's so many avenues in
Oh,
laboratory
yeah.
medicine. It's
Yeah, for
crazy.
sure.
So I think if someone told me when I was in college, so many bio majors are lost.
Yeah,
Like their third and fourth year, they're like, what am I going to do with this degree,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So if someone can talk to them their freshman or sophomore year, I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the other thing is that you go in, you have to make this decision when you're 18 years old. What am I going to do with my life? I'm going to go into, as you said, I like science. Why don't I'll just do biology? Well, what are you going to do with it? I'll figure it out in 4 years. And it if that was if that's an option, either to go for a little extra training through that school, or go into a different program, a slightly different program, or if there are labs that work with that school to come in and grab up those lost biology majors. It just sounds like a really great way to at least have that initial recruitment, and do that. I know there's in terms of like the training program you were talking about. I know of at least one, just completely unrelated, but I know of at least one trucking company, manufacturer, that they bring in young people and teach them how to be diesel mechanics, and all they have to do is sign a contract for 5 years, and they get paid good money. And why can't we use a similar? That's a model that you can use, and not only the money, but it's also, I think the other thing too is it a fulfilling career? And I think that I think all of our readers at CLP and various conferences you go to and the people you work with would say, yeah, it's a fulfilling career. And look at the pandemic, all the important. Thank God for the labs, because we'd still be in a big mess if we didn't have people administering tests, running tests, developing tests. That's a whole other area. You can develop tests and do real science and research, and there's so much, as you said, there's so much you can do, and just starting at that bench can lead on to such a really interesting career and set of experiences. So I think that. I don't know if we've answered any questions today, but I think we've raised a lot of questions that can be answered, and I think we've talked through some interesting scenarios. And then with that, I think unfortunately we reached our end of our time, and but I don't think our discussion. So Shawn, I hope that maybe you can come back. Maybe sometime in the near future, and we can talk through this a little bit more. We can have some more insights and what we're hearing and your experiences in the field. And I think this really is the biggest challenge facing laboratories today. You've also given us some good practical tips for recruiting and retaining our staff. So I thank you for that. I also want to thank everyone for listening. Look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future, and visit us online at clpmag.com, and of course on all the major social media platforms. So until next time.